Mr. Gavin Wood.
Cheers, Ursula. Thank you. Gracias, veramente. It's lovely to be here. First, a few thank yous. It's Decoded, as I guess you all know, it's like a global event. There's a lot of different Decodeds going on. There's a lot of people that have worked very hard in the last few weeks to get this together. So I do want to do a few shouts. Jimmy and his team. Thank you so much for getting this over the finish line. Thank you to Alex, Marina, the Ad-lib guys for putting this great festival together. Thank you to all our ambassadors. I met a few of you in the last few days, but those that I haven't met, I extend my gratitude. Gracias a ustedes para venir aquí. All right, good. So today I want to talk a little bit about what I've been working on for about the last year, actually. And I hope it will, sort of soon come to fruition. But I want to give a bit of an introduction as to what it is and why we're doing it. So governance. It's a fairly core element of Polkadot. It's something I think it's reasonable to say that we have been front leaders trying to sort of push interesting new models and concepts, try them out, experiment. Why do we care? Polkadot and for that matter, all of the parachains on the Polkadot in the Polkadot.Sama ecosystem are inherently upgradable. It's a great thing. We use WebAssembly, make this stuff adaptable, changeable, evolvable over time. But in order to come to a decision over what it should change into, there needs to be some decision-making process. Now, in normal centralized organizations, it's basically the CEO or one of the delegates of the CEO that decides where a product goes over time. We can't do that in a decentralized ecosystem. No, or at least we really shouldn't. And so we want to have a mechanism, a process, in order to come to a collective decision over how and when a protocol should evolve. And this basically is governance. So the current state of governance, which I presume most of you are at least a little familiar with, but in case you're not, it's a tricameral system, so 3 chambers. There's a technical committee. They don't do all that much, but they have some sort of powers. The council, who do quite a lot, have quite a lot of powers, and the ultimate power still rests with the token holders, who sort of vote on stuff as it comes up. There are some interesting things that we came up with and implemented. Adaptive quorum biasing is basically a way to try and manage the idea that there should be a quorum as like a specific turnout, but also the fact that in reality not that many people turn out for that many votes, and we still need something that practically works. Conviction voting, basically, I'll go into it in a bit, and delegation. Okay, so what's good about it? Well, conviction voting is kind of cool. It moves us away from the traditional sort of, if you have more coins, you get more power or influence, towards if you have the network's long-term interests at heart, you get more influence, right? So essentially, it allows you to lock yourself into Polkadot or the parachain, and in doing so, multiply up the amount of influence that you would otherwise have. And delegation allows, basically passive holders. This is sort of taken from the notion of liquid democracy, where you can essentially delegate your voting power over to somebody that you think is going to make good decisions on your behalf. But what's the sort of bad elements? Well, it's slow. I mean, it was sort of devised to be slow in order to be safe, but it is, you can't take away the fact it is very, very slow. Under normal scheduling, it takes about 2 months for a proposal to go through the voting stage and then eventually become enacted. It's pretty clunky in that it can only one referendum can happen at once, and so you've basically got this like 28-day period where only one thing is happening. Not really very agile, and it's pretty inaccessible. Like if you put a proposal for a vote in Polkadot network, the chances are that it will never actually get voted upon because like there's not that many referendums ever actually make it to the voting stage. And the ugly element, sort of, decentralization, in that there are centralized elements to it, right? The council is a centralized element. Like, yeah, it's voted in, so it's kind of like, in some sense, accountable, but nonetheless, it's, there are individuals whose names are sort of up there, and they're making decisions that affect people, and this is a risk, a centralization risk. Now, okay, I mentioned it twice. Unfortunately, we're unable to use the magic power of HDMI, so I can't bring you the YouTube video, but it's good, and if you look at the slides afterwards, this little blue thing is actually a link to a great scene from a great comedy called Red Dwarf. Probably not many of you know that, though. Anyway, the solution. Well, the solution is twofold. First is like lower the barriers. So make stuff easy, cheap. So we make it easy and cheap to make a proposal for how a protocol should change, for what the network should do. We make it easy and cheap to get those proposals voted upon, and we make it easy and cheap for people to vote on them. We also remove these centralized artifacts to the degree that we can. So we remove the council, we remove the technical committee. All right, great, sounds easy. Unlimited referendum on everything all at the same time. This is a picture from a modern reincarnation of the game Missile Command, where basically these missiles come from the top of the screen, and you have these sort of gun at the bottom, and you kind of have to shoot missiles up to try to hit the missiles before they get down and hit your cities. As it gets incrementally harder as you play the game, and more of these things come raining down from the top of the screen. Well, this is sort of like what we're doing with, with the new sort of governance proposition, in that, if you can have unlimited referendum from everybody all at once, then you've got all these kind of potentially bad proposals coming in, and you've got like limited number of responsible actors kind of shooting them down before they get enacted and like do something bad for the network. So how can we make it safe? Well, there's a few ways that we can make this stuff safe. Right? So one of them is that we limit the number of active decisions going on at the same time. Right? So there's not too much for anyone to consider. The more things that there are to consider, the less time you can consider each one, the higher the chance there is that something will go through that you didn't expect. If you limit the number of decisions, then that obviously reduces that risk. We can also restrict the possible repercussions of these decisions, of these referendums, of these proposals. Right? So this is essentially like reducing how dangerous these sort of missiles coming from the top actually are if they come down and hit. Another thing that we could do is we can require, very high turnouts or approval levels before we accept, before we allow a referendum to pass and for its repercussions to be felt. And then finally, we can also increase the general periods of time required for these decisions to be taken. More time means more people have enough time to consider the ramifications, the repercussions, whether they really believe it's a good idea. They have more time to vote, either up or down. We can increase the period before the voting begins. We can increase the period while the voting is happening. Maybe when it looks like it's going to pass, we can have like a period where we get to, are you really sure you want it to pass? And we can even increase the period after voting ends, not in order to vote it down, potentially to cancel it, but also in case individuals really disagree with what the proposal means for the network, for the protocol, and so they can exit or they can take according remedial action themselves. Now, safety and agility, it's a bit like this old security and convenience. It's a trade-off. You got a slider bar. You can be very safe, but not very agile, or you can be very agile, but maybe not so safe. Now, governance version 1 restricted activity and introduced trust, right? Introduced these central bodies, and it restricted the amount of activity that happened to like basically one referendum a month. And so it sort of became safe for that reason. But we want something more agile, some more fast-moving, more flexible, and less centralized. So governance 2 allows us to use many more of these elements of making governance safe in order to get like a more optimum balance, and an optimum and adaptive balance, by which I mean that for different kinds of referenda, we may have different kinds of safety measures. So what we're essentially doing is we're going to restrict things like throughput. We're going to increase things like the periods, the voting periods, the time, depending on the theoretical or the expected damage that could be done by any particular referendum. If the referendum if we can classify a referendum as being like low impact, then we don't need to be quite as conservative with our safeguards. And this is it. So not all referendums, not all proposals are equal. Right? In governance version 1, they were all treated equally. For those of you who have some sort of technical knowledge, there are within the Polkadot and within the sort of the substrate, any parachains built on substrate, which I think is all of them, within these frameworks, there is a level of privilege that code executes with. It's called the origin. And there are different origins to denote different levels of privilege. It's a little bit like the kind of user or whatever on a Unix operating system. And so a proposal actually is two different things, right? In a proposal, there is what you want to do, the operation. It's like spend 100 dot from the treasury. Would be one. Deploy a parachain, make a new system parachain in this slot and deploy some code. Different kinds of things that you might want to do through governance. The other thing that makes up a proposal is the origin, which is basically the privilege level with which this operation will run, right? So like who or what is authorizing this operation to happen. Now, most operations require a particular origin. Not all of them. Some of them can work with many different origins. An example of that, for example, would be the transfer operation. You use this all the time if you want to transfer some DOT tokens or Kusama tokens or any other network tokens from your account that you control to some other account, right? It's an operation. It's called transfer. You wrap it up in a transaction and you send it off to the network. Now, what the network does is it checks and it says, okay, who's authorizing this transfer? And then the origin, right, that it's checking is the signed origin. It means that you've signed the transaction. You've proven that it's you, it really is you who wants to authorize this transfer. And it makes sure that that proof is there, that the origin is signed. Now, what we do in governance 2 is we say, well, look, there are many different kinds of origins, many different kind of that do many different or authorize many different kinds of things. Some of them are high impact, some of them are low impact. And we have a different track, a different kind of pipeline for each origin type. And we can each of these tracks can have different parameters, different thresholds. And we can make sure that these parameters, these thresholds, are less stringent for the tracks that can only pass relatively low impact things and have higher, more conservative parameters, higher thresholds for those that are inherently more dangerous. So let's think of some origins. Root is the all-powerful origin in substrate chains, Polkadot, Kusama, all of the chains that you know. This is what everything executed with in the old governance system. There's only one level, and it was super user level, root. Can do anything. We've got other origins. We've got like parachain admin, which can create a new parachain, right? If you want to deploy a system parachain, you don't need to be able to do anything. You just need to be able to do this thing. And the parachain admin is allowed to do this. Big spender, that's another origin. Big spender can spend a bunch of tokens from the treasury. Tipper is like a super low spender. It can transfer just a few tokens from the treasury, right? And it's easy to see that the impact of each of these things is different, right? The impact of being able to potentially do anything is much higher than the impact of being able to spend, I don't know, whatever, 10 dot from the treasury. So the sorts of things that we can customize within these referendum tracks, there's a few. Lead-in period. So how long it takes before the voting actually really matters. Confirmation period. Once it appears that a referendum is actually going to pass, how long does it need to keep passing for before we actually approve it and end the referendum? Turnout and approval requirements, right? So basically your bread and butter for a voting system. How many people have actually bothered voting? And of those, how many of them really want it to pass? And then how many referenda can be happening at the same time, right? There are some things, if they're low impact, you can have lots of them all happening and it doesn't really matter. But if it's very, very high impact, you maybe want to restrict it so only a few or even just one can happen at once. So let's look into the life cycle of a referendum in governance version 2. There's a few sort of stages, right, that we're going to go through. First stage is proposing. I put the cowboy hat on because it's kind of like it's the most cowboy thing at the moment, right? It's like all of the other things are like decide and think and consider. This is cowboy. This is like, it doesn't matter, right? We're going to have loads of proposals, yeah? We bring them in. No limit to the number of proposals per account. No limit to the number of proposals in total. Anyone can propose a referendum at any time. As soon as you propose a referendum, everybody in the ecosystem on your chain can vote on it, right? It's like ultra low barrier to entry. The amount of deposit is the minimum amount that we can get away with to prevent chain bloat. So it's very low. Cowboy, shoot from the hip. Then we get serious. So once we have all of these proposals, all these referendums that people are all voting on, we have to decide whether a referendum should pass. Referendums stay, or these proposals stay undecided. People can vote on them, but we're not going to take any action quite yet. 3 things need to happen before we are ready to take some action. The first thing is, a second deposit must be paid. It doesn't have to be the person that put the original referendum in. It can be it could be a bunch of people who all come together and put that deposit in. But the point of this deposit is basically we have a limited ability to have referenda that are actively being potentially finishing, right? Potentially being decided upon. So this extra deposit is also to prevent certain data structures getting spammed. Second thing that we need to do is allow the lead-in period to finish, right? The assembled voters, the token holders, the deciders, the voters, need to get some degree, depending on the track, some degree of notice that this is happening. And finally, the track has capacity. Capacity is basically the maximum number of referenda that can be happening at the same time for this track, right? Tracks are entirely independent. Some tracks will have a very high capacity. The tipper track, for example, can spend 10 DOT from the treasury. We can have thousands of these proposals, and it wouldn't really matter if some percentage got through where it was like, someone didn't notice and it just sort of got through. Really doesn't matter. It does matter if it's like an upgrade proposal, right? It does matter if it's root level. At that point, we really need to make sure that each and every one is well considered. So we have a low capacity. Once we are deciding, so once these three things have been fulfilled, we move into the next thing that can happen is that it can be what's called confirming. Now, this is basically your fail-safe, right? If a referendum that's bad gets to the point of passing for whatever reason, right? Maybe everyone was on holiday. Maybe everyone was busy listening to a talk by someone, and some guy comes along, puts in a dodgy referendum. No one notices. They vote for it themselves, and like, now it's gonna pass. No. So we move into this new stage, confirming. This allows us to vote down a referendum before it finishes the process. So once it's passing, it has to keep passing for a period of time. We call this period of time the confirmation period, right? Some tracks have long confirmation periods, some have much shorter confirmation periods. If it's the root track, so this like all-powerful referendum track, the confirmation period is like 2 days. So once a referendum starts passing, it has to stay passing for 2 days. And if for some reason it stops passing, like if there's a bunch of people vote no or some people change their minds, then it will go back and it will have to do another get passing again, get confirmed for 2 whole days again. Now, controversial referenda will probably go into this state of being confirmed and then come out again, probably cycle through as people vote it up, and then more people come in, and it goes down, and maybe more people come in and vote it up, and so on. As it gets fought out, it will move in and out of this like passing, not passing. But it has to be passing for the full confirmation period before we end the referendum. So what do we mean by passing? Well, there's 2 elements that we measure. As a referendum is ongoing, we continuously measure these elements. One of them is support. Now, support is a little bit like turnout. It's actually a game theoretically sound version of turnout. So the problem with measuring turnout, which is to say like the number of people who are voting, as a proportion of the total number of votes that could be cast, is that if you vote against, so if you don't want something to pass, you have to decide whether to vote. If you vote no, you're increasing the turnout. Like you're making the referendum be like more legitimate. Yeah. So, and if there's already quite a lot of people who want it to pass, you're kind of pushing it towards actually passing by voting no, and this is really problematic. So, in order to determine support, we don't count the nay votes, we don't count the negative votes, right? We only count the positive votes, and this is the number of positive votes as a proportion of the total possible number of votes. It's measured ignoring the conviction, because we want to measure the legitimacy. We want to measure like how many votes are being made. The second thing that we measure is approval, right? Now, approval is the total number, the number of positive votes as a proportion of the total number of votes cast. And this is after conviction. So this is after you're able to power up your votes by locking yourself in to whatever network it is, Polkadot, Kusama, whatever. And we count conviction in order to make sure that we are measuring an overall sentiment of individuals, of voters, with the long-term interests of the network. We're weighting it towards long-term interests. Now, the interesting thing is that the thresholds that we require for a referendum to be passing change over time, right? At the beginning, the thresholds are high. At the end, the thresholds are as low as they can be without compromising our sort of democratic bounds. Why? Very simple. It allows us to be very agile in our referendum process. Essentially, it allows us to say, if a proposal is uncontroversial and very well supported, everybody on the network thinks it's brilliant, then we should allow it to pass sooner than a proposal that is controversial and where maybe there's a lot of turnout, but it's not, the approval isn't maybe there, or maybe there is lots of approval, but not that many people voted. In these cases, we want to allow more time to allow the network to form a more considered opinion. But if the opinion is very, very clear, the sentiment across the network is very clear, it allows us to end the vote and start the enactment process much faster, and therefore proceed at a faster pace in terms of network changes. So here's an example curve for the support. So this is support, if you remember. It's the number of approval votes, or voters almost, as a proportion of the total, the maximum number of votes or voters. And the sort of curve that we might sort of expect to see on this is something that begins with 50%. The 50% thing, you might say, oh, hold on a minute, why does it begin at 100%? This is it initially did, until it was pointed out by the Web3 Foundation's chief scientist, that if we have also the approval curve, and that begins at 100%, then effectively this means that we have 100% votes coming out. The maths works out. Feel free to question me offline about it. So we begin with like 50% eligible votes must be cast in favor at the beginning of the voting, right? We have a limit, a hard limit of 28 days. After 28 days, we drop to our lowest level. So we begin at 50%, and maybe we drop to 10%. Now, these are parameters. Different tracks can have different curves, right? Some of them are going to drop off really fast. Some of them are going to stay high for a long time. An example approval curve, so this would start at 100, which basically means everybody who votes must be in favor, right? Really hard to meet that. But over time, it drops off until eventually we end up with 50%, or just above, epsilon above 50%, right? And at that point, basically what we're saying is there must be a majority in favor. But if it's only by the slimmest of slim majorities, then it takes 28 days before the network will accept it, right? 28 days for more no votes to come along and try and push it down below that level, yeah? It's because we want to be safe. So as I said, if 28 days passes, and if 28 days elapses without the proposal sort of being passed, then it's automatically rejected by default, right? So after 28 days, it gets rejected. Done. The only way it will be approved or accepted is if it passes for this confirmation period at some point within the 28 days. And that's the two ways that it can end. Basically, it either ends early with approval, or it goes out to the full 28 days and fails. If it is approved, then it's scheduled for execution. There is a period between it being approved and it getting executed. Call this the enactment period. This is a concept from governance version 1. It's already in place. Each track has a minimum period, right? There isn't a maximum. If you want to propose something that will happen in 10 years' time, it's like, yeah, whatever. But there is a minimum period. You can't propose something before this enactment period. Safety measure. What about interventions? What if something is passes, and then you suddenly realize before it actually gets enacted that it's bad? Maybe someone discovers a bug in a code upgrade. Interventions are sort of interesting. The realization is that although people may act in the best interest of the network, sometimes not all information is available, and ultimately, people can be, like, there is a coordination time. Suppose you're half a day out from a proposal passing, yeah, and like the confirmation period ending, and a bug is discovered. Well, everyone who has voted in approval would vote against it, given enough time, but there may not be enough time. So what do? Well, we allow the possibility of intervention, which is basically a special origin, the proposal cancellation, or potentially proposal delay origin, which is one that can kick in a lot sooner than most of the other origins, like the time periods are much lower. And what it does is it either cancels or postpones another referendum. So this allows the network to sort of come back and like correct itself safely. What else have we got in governance 2? Agile Delegation. All right, so you're familiar with delegation. This, what we bring in governance 2 is a very, I'm very happy with this feature. It's a feature that I think all democracies should have. But I guess we're one of the first, if not the first, to actually implement it. Essentially, we're familiar with the concept of delegation, right? It's like you can pick someone and you can basically hand them your voting power because you believe that their interests are aligned with yours or their voting record is somehow something that you agree with, whatever. You have some expectation that them representing you is good for you. Unfortunately, different people vote for different things in different ways. A proposal against, for one thing in a democracy, you may agree with politician X, right? But for a different subject that they may need to vote on, you may not agree with them at all. You may in fact agree with politician Y. It's like, I would like to give my voting power to this party on environmental issues, but this party on civil rights issues, right? But there is no way of doing that in traditional voting systems. There's not even any way of doing that in more like agile liquid democracy style delegation systems. But now there is in Polkadot and anything that uses governance 2. For different origins, you can have a different delegate. So you can delegate to one person or organization or whatever, voter, for tipping. You can delegate to another one for network upgrades. You can delegate to another one for controversial rescue attempts. You can delegate to another one for treasury spending. You can delegate to another one for common good parachain deployment. All of the different origins, there's about, I don't know, like 12, but this is like infinitely extendable. You can delegate to a different individual. Now you may say, well, I don't really care. I delegate to just one person. Fine, that's easy too. But if you want to delegate to 2, you want to delegate to, you know, your local ambassador for tips, and you want to delegate to Parity technologies for network upgrades, you can do that. Some things that we're going to bring in, these will not be in the initial governance 2, they'll be in a later upgrade, are passive delegation. And there's one other thing that's linked to it. This is essentially where you as a token holder don't have to send a transaction to delegate your voting power to somebody else, right? You can do it for free. In fact, your wallet can do it for you without you taking too much action. I mean, if it's a responsible wallet, it will actually check with you who you want to delegate to. I would hope all wallets in the ecosystem do that. Yeah, this is a way of saying, I'm okay with this account using the voting power from my account. And you can do that without paying any transaction fees. Actually, it's like a collect call. They pay the transaction fees if they can be bothered to take your votes, to take your delegated voting power. In addition to it, there is free undelegation. What this means in combination is that wallets, when they build these features in, can have a very, very low friction interface that wouldn't require the user to spend any funds, would happen potentially in the background, that would allow wallets to basically say, hey, who of these individuals, ecosystem entities, organizations, whatever, would you like to align yourself with for network voting? The user wouldn't need to care about the costs of delegation. They wouldn't need to care about the costs of undelegation. In fact, the wallet could make all of the underlying sort of transactions just as part of the back end. There would not need to be any alteration to the overall user experience. Maybe we will also, I mean, there's thoughts about this. It's not something that I have a sort of formed opinion on, but maybe we would also introduce incentives for participation in governance. It's a thorny issue, arguments on both sides. So let's talk a little bit about governance in normal instances is fairly relaxed affair. Several days passes, you have a look, seems cool, vote up, vote down, whatever. What happens in an emergency, right? There have been one or two emergencies in the past with the Kusama network. What happens when the clock is ticking and you need to pass something quickly? So, general solution is, well, if we want to speed things up, we have to make it safer in other ways, right? So we have to make sure that the origin is low impact, so the proposal is safe in that regard, or we would also like to know that it is like time critical. How do we be certain that that proposal is safe? Well, as I say, low impact origin. But sometimes to fix something in an emergency, you really do need to be able to do anything. You need to do a code upgrade. You need to change some, I don't know, fiddle with some bits in the state. How do we ensure that a proposal is safe and that it's time critical? Well, the obvious thing to do is, well, we oracleize the information, right? We get some, I don't know, experts or whatever to tell the network, this is safe, it's okay, you can sort of run on a different track, on a faster track. All right, oracleizing expert information. Easy. 1, 2, 3. There's 3 things that we need to do. First, track everyone's level of expertise. Second, allow everyone to register their sentiment. Third, aggregate it all. Okay. 2 and 3, super easy, right? Blockchains are really good at that. 1, less easy. Quite a lot less easy. Fairly difficult. So, how do we do it? We introduce another body, and we try and solve this, or we try and make some sort of solution in a game theoretically sound manner. The name for this body is the Polkadot Fellowship. I'm not going to give a huge talk on it now. It deserves its own talk. It will get its own talk, maybe in the next few weeks. But put shortly, it is an on-chain membership body to recognize the expertise level and compensate all individuals who hold expert knowledge of Polkadot network, protocol, and act in line with its broad interest and philosophy, right? So it's a ranked organization, not entirely dissimilar to, if you do any martial arts organizations, the good ones anyway, tend to be, have clear structure as you get to the top, certain syllabus, certain requirements, both in terms of your behavior and in terms of your expertise level in the art. So it's based in some sense on that. Peer review for most of the levels, but as you get to the very top and your influence increases, it becomes general referendum in order to basically avoid the possibility of this becoming a clique. There is a minimal process, minimal financial barrier to entry, right? So basically anybody can register as a candidate. Open and clear requirements at each rank for the expertise level for what must have been achieved. Huge amount of members that it's capable of handling technically, with the idea being that this actually, we really do aim to get maybe tens of thousands is being overly ambitious for the next year or two, but like certainly hundreds. And I would hope we can, over time, make it thousands. Internally, it's quite cool. The palette, for those of you who are familiar with Substrate and writing code on it, the logic that implements all of this referendum stuff, all this governance 2 stuff, like the tracks and the delegation and the multi-role and the origin, all this stuff. This works not just with conviction voting for people who hold tokens as the voters, but also for this, for the fellowship, right? So there's actually 2 different instantiations of referendum. One of them is for the token holders, the other is for the fellowship members. And the idea is that there's only one fellowship. It covers the Polkadot protocol, right? Kusama uses the Polkadot protocol as well. So Kusama would be bridged, and the fellowship would act as the fellowship for both networks. Now, the fellowship is powerless. I want to emphasize this. Fellowship is not a body that can do anything directly to the Polkadot protocol, to any of the protocols, to any of the networks. It has no power whatsoever to change the protocol. The only thing it can do is declare that it believes a particular proposal is safe and time critical. Right? It's an oracle, nothing more. Now it places that on a whitelist. Whitelist is, there's actually a palette called the Whitelist Palette, and it has this whitelist inside it. Now there is a special governance origin called whitelisted root, right? It has its own track. Its track is more agile than the root track. The root track is very, very much not agile because it's so dangerous. But the whitelisted root track is a bit less dangerous because the only thing, although items on the whitelisted root can ultimately be executed with root-level privileges, they have to be whitelisted. And the fact that they have to be whitelisted makes it inherently that bit less dangerous and therefore allows us to have a less conservatively parameterized track that the referenda run on. If a proposal, for some reason, gets executed with whitelisted root and yet isn't whitelisted, it does nothing. Just evaporates. So there's a few other changes that this brings about. There's no council. If there's no council, like the treasury doesn't really work because it was the councillors that decided on treasury spending before. The tipping mechanism doesn't really work because like it was the councillors that were the ones that determined the tips. Well, now treasury spending and tipping work the same way. They're just spending money from the treasury pot, and we do for both of them what we do for everything else, which is have a referendum. But the nice thing is that the referendums are now so agile, it can actually work fast. The timeline for the rollout, or at least the proposal of the rollout of Governance 2, is imminent. The pull request is sitting there. It's actually been sitting there for some time now. The audit is I think about to start, but we're not going to go too deep into that for Kusama, of course, being the untested early experimental network. And yeah, it's once merged, it will be in a runtime upgrade proposal on a Canary network. Look out for it near you soon. For the initial rollout, we will not remove the governance 1. They'll actually be coexisting in parallel. And once we're happy that governance 2 is indeed working properly and we're got a bit more confidence over it, we will launch a referendum on governance 2 to remove governance 1. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.